They said the Marquise's mansion smelled of roses and rot, perfume masking sin, silk hiding scandal. In the year 1803, when Lima still glittered as the jewel of the Spanish crown in South America, there stood a house on the Col de San Martin that everyone whispered about, the Velasco Mansion. Once the pride of colonial nobility, its marble corridors and gilded mirrors reflected a decaying truth. Behind those carved wooden doors, a secret was growing, one that would bring the entire city to its knees. The Marquise of Velasco, recently widowed, was a woman of elegance, influence, and unfulfilled longing. Her husband, a cruel aristocrat, had left her with vast lands, a cold bed, and 3 daughters who mirrored her beauty and her loneliness. But loneliness has a way of breaking even the strongest of spirits, and within that void crept something forbidden, something human. Among the household's many servants was Samuel, a young man enslaved from Angola. Tall, with an almost regal poise and eyes that spoke more than his tongue ever could. He was unlike any man in Lima. The Marquise noticed him first not as property, but as a presence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of calm rebellion. When he moved, even silence seemed to bend around him. One humid summer night, when the house slept and the lamps burned low, that fragile line between master and slave was crossed. What began as an act of desire soon became an addiction that neither could control. To the Marquise, Samuel became both her sin and her salvation, the one person who made her feel alive in a world ruled by appearances and hypocrisy. But sin has an echo. The 3 daughters, raised in the shadow of their mother's quiet desperation, began to see Samuel too, not as a servant, but as something more. Isabella, the eldest, admired his strength. Lucia, the middle child, envied her mother's boldness. And Camila, the youngest, confused affection with obsession. By the time the truth began to unfold, the household had turned into a cage of jealousy and temptation. Whispers spread among the other servants. Strange glances were exchanged at the dinner table. The family's priest, Father Ignacio, noticed how the women of the house grew pale when Samuel entered the room, how the Marquise's hand trembled at the mere mention of confession. Then came the pregnancies. First the Marquise, her advanced age making it a miracle or a curse. Then Isabella, then Lucia, and finally Camila, each belly swelling with the same unspoken truth. 4 women, 1 house, 1 man. Lima erupted. Rumors spread through the cobblestone streets like wildfire. The Marquise's bloodline has been tainted, they said. The devil lives in her house. Priests declared it blasphemy. The governor demanded an inquiry. The family name, once whispered with reverence, now dripped with venom. When the Inquisition intervened, it wasn't just Samuel on trial. It was the idea that power and purity could ever coexist. Samuel was accused of witchcraft, seduction through dark arts, and defiling sacred nobility. Tortured in the dungeons beneath the city, he confessed to everything they wanted to hear. Not because it was true, but because pain has a way of making truth irrelevant. The Marquise begged for mercy, but the law offered none. Samuel was executed publicly in the Plaza Mayor, a spectacle meant to cleanse the city's shame. The Marquise's daughters were sent away, their fates sealed in silence. And she herself, stripped of title and faith, spent her final days wandering the echoing halls of her once grand home, whispering Samuel's name until the day she died. Even now, the people of Lima say that on moonless nights, if you walk past the ruins of the Velasco mansion, you can hear her voice, soft and broken, calling for the man who turned sin into legend. A tale of lust, love, and vengeance. Of chains that bound more than the body. They bound the soul. This is the story of Samuel, the slave who dared to love the untouchable, and the noble house whose forbidden desire burned an empire's pride to ash. In the early 1800s, the Velasco mansion stood like a monument to Spain's glory in the heart of Lima, Peru, towering columns of marble, imported mirrors from Seville, chandeliers heavy with crystals and silk drapes that caught the ocean light. Every inch of the estate reflected wealth and power. Yet beneath the grandeur, the foundation was cracking, not with time, but with moral rot. To the world outside, the Marquise of Velasco represented the last flicker of an old aristocracy. Her name was spoken in hushed reverence at social gatherings, her parties were grand, and her family bloodline traced back to Castilian knights. But anyone who walked past the mansion's tall iron gates could feel it. The quiet tension, the sense that something inside was deeply wrong. The house itself seemed alive with contradictions. On the walls hung paintings of saints and martyrs, yet in the corners, Servants whispered prayers not found in any Bible. The chapel in the east wing smelled of incense. But behind its altar were hidden letters. Confessions of love written by trembling hands. The air was thick with the scent of burning candles and guilt. The Marquise was a woman molded by duty and decorum, yet she carried the loneliness of a prisoner. Since the death of her husband, Don Rafael de Velasco, her life had become a long performance, smiling at gatherings, offering charity to the poor, speaking of virtue and faith, all while drowning in the silence of her own house. Her daughters, Isabella, Lucia, and Camila, were her mirrors, each reflecting a piece of her fading youth, each bound by the same invisible expectations. It was said that no laughter was ever heard in the Velasco mansion after Don Rafael's funeral. The servants walked on eggshells, the daughters spoke in whispers, and the Marquise herself spent hours in her study staring out at the courtyard where peacocks once danced. The wealth around her felt like a curse. Every gold frame and marble stair reminded her of a life that demanded perfection, even if it meant suffocating the soul. And then came Samuel. He arrived at the Velasco estate as an inherited slave, part of the late Don Rafael's assets. Tall, strong, and unnervingly calm, Samuel moved with a quiet grace that defied his chains. His origins were whispered about among the servants, that he came from Luanda, that he had once been educated by missionaries before being sold into bondage, that his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen both God and hell. To the Marquise, he was at first invisible, just another shadow in the long line of those who served her family. But in time, she began to notice the way he worked, how his hands shaped order out of chaos. When he repaired a broken chair, it looked new again. When he polished the family's silver, it gleamed brighter than before. He moved through the mansion as if he belonged there, not as property, but as part of its living rhythm. And perhaps that was what drew her attention, his dignity. In a world where slaves were expected to bow their heads, Samuel carried himself like an equal. His silence spoke volumes. When he looked at her, it wasn't with fear or submission. It was with understanding, a dangerous kind of understanding. The Marquise began to see the house through his eyes. The velvet curtains, once a symbol of refinement, now looked like veils hiding decay. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to sneer at her from their gilded frames. Every luxury she had once admired began to feel suffocating. The more she watched Samuel, the more she began to sense life. Something she had forgotten existed within her gilded cage. The servants noticed the change before anyone else. They whispered that the Marquise lingered too long in the garden when Samuel was tending to the roses. That she asked about his health, his family, his past, questions no noblewoman should ask a slave. But gossip is the lifeblood of a dying house, and soon, everyone felt the electricity that pulsed through the air when the two were near each other. To outsiders, the Velasco mansion still stood proud, its gates gleaming under the Peruvian sun. But inside, it was a haunted palace, haunted not by ghosts, but by forbidden emotion. Each glance between the Marquise and Samuel felt like an act of rebellion against everything the house represented. The house of Velasco had been built on obedience, wives to husbands, servants to masters, daughters to mothers. But as the Marquise began to see Samuel not as a possession but as a man, she cracked the very foundation of her world. For a noblewoman to desire her slave was not merely scandalous, it was blasphemy. It defied race, class, and God. Yet she could not stop herself. It began with small gestures. A glass of wine left for him on the table after dinner, a soft word of thanks, a glance that lasted too long. Samuel, bound by chains but not by fear, did not resist. He understood the danger as clearly as she did, but in that danger he found power. For the first time in his life, the balance between master and slave trembled. By the end of that year, the Velasco mansion had changed. The music of the harpsichord no longer filled the halls. The daughters grew curious about their mother's absences. The Marquise herself appeared paler, distracted, her once perfect composure now cracked by guilt and longing. The mansion, once a symbol of stability and heritage, had become a stage for moral collapse. Every portrait, every candle, every locked door bore silent witness to what was happening behind closed curtains. The nobility of the house, its grandeur, its pride, was nothing more than a costume worn by people drowning in their own secrets. The decay was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was the decay of a family that had lost its soul, of a class that no longer understood the difference between righteousness and repression. By 1803, The house of Velasco had become a contradiction, magnificent on the outside, hollow within. The same could be said of the city itself, of the entire colonial system that treated love as sin and cruelty as tradition. And at the heart of it all stood two people, one enslaved, one imprisoned by her own name, daring to find something pure in a world built on lies. That was the true rot beneath the marble, not the affair itself, but the hypocrisy that made it necessary to hide. When Samuel first arrived at the Velasco plantation, the other servants whispered that he carried something strange in his eyes, something that did not belong to a man in chains. He did not walk with the hunched shoulders of the enslaved. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that unsettled both masters and slaves alike. It was as if he knew a truth that the others had forgotten, that no man could truly be owned, not in spirit. Samuel had come from Luanda, taken as a boy by Portuguese traders and sold across the Atlantic. Unlike many others, he had been taught to read and speak before his capture. His father, a tribal interpreter for Europeans, had believed that knowledge would keep his son safe. It did not. Yet those lessons lived within him, small embers glowing in the dark, waiting for air. When Samuel spoke Spanish, it carried a rhythm foreign to Lima, soft, deliberate, melodic, his words shaped by two worlds that never should have met. He had worked for the Velascos for nearly 4 years before the story began to unravel. During that time, he became known not for rebellion but for perfection. Every task he was given, he completed without flaw. The mansion's walls gleamed where his hands had touched them. The horses trusted him more than their riders. Even the youngest daughter, Camila, said that when Samuel entered a room, it felt warmer, but his beauty, that was what no one could ignore. He was tall, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes so deep that they seemed to hold light inside them. His shoulders were broad from labor, yet his movements were graceful, like a man trained not for servitude but for ceremony. The Marquise noticed this first when he knelt before her one morning to polish her riding boots. She looked down and caught his reflection in the black leather, a fleeting moment that made her heart stutter. He did not raise his eyes, but she felt him looking anyway. From that day forward, Samuel became a ghost that haunted her every thought. He was always there, silent in the gardens, still in the corridor, strong and calm among the chaos of servants. But he was never invisible. The daughters, too, began to notice. Isabella, the eldest, admired him for his silence. He never begged, never gossiped, never laughed when others did. To her, that silence felt powerful. Lucia, the middle daughter, was drawn to his intelligence. She once found him reading a torn page from a discarded Bible and asked where he learned his letters. He only smiled and said, "My father taught me before God forgot him." That answer stayed with her. And Camila, the youngest, she was simply fascinated. To her, Samuel was the embodiment of every story she had ever been told to fear. But to the Marquise, Samuel was something far more dangerous. He was temptation disguised as virtue. Every noblewoman in Lima was taught from birth to see men like Samuel as property, bodies without souls, laborers without love. Yet there was something about him that tore at that belief. When she spoke, he listened with genuine attention, not the trained obedience of a servant, but the respect of an equal. When she was angry, he did not flinch. When she was kind, he did not flatter. He treated her like a person, not a mistress. That was what broke her. One humid evening, as rain lashed against the glass windows, she found him in the courtyard, shirt-soaked, tending to a broken gate. Lightning flashed, illuminating the curve of his shoulders, the sheen of rain on his skin. She called his name, a whisper swallowed by the storm. When he turned, she saw it in his eyes, understanding, longing, and fear all tangled together. No words were spoken that night, yet something shifted. The distance between master and slave collapsed, if only for a heartbeat. After that, she could not look at him the same. At breakfast, her spoon trembled. At Mass, her prayers faltered. And when she dreamt, it was of a man whose very existence was a sin. Samuel, for his part, fought the same battle. He knew what it meant for a slave to even look at a white woman, let alone the mistress of his house. The punishment was not just death. It was degradation, pain beyond imagining. But he could not unsee her either. He had watched her pace through the halls like a ghost, wrapped in grief and silk. He had seen her tenderness toward the servants, her moments of quiet sorrow when she thought no one was looking. He knew she was trapped, just as he was, though her cage was made of gold and his of iron. Their connection deepened through silence. A dropped handkerchief, a glance in the candlelight, a door left slightly open. The kind of intimacy that can destroy lives without a single word. One evening, while the daughters played the piano and the priest visited the parlor, the Marquise entered the servants' quarters unannounced. The air smelled of sweat, wood, and ash. Samuel stood by the hearth, startled, yet unafraid. She asked him to fix the clasp on her bracelet. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. When his fingers brushed her skin, something inside her broke open. He looked up, just once, and everything that had been denied to both of them came rushing forward. In that single glance was years of hunger, shame, and the desperate human need to be seen. From that moment, the Velasco house became a living secret. Every step Samuel took, every breath the Marquise drew, felt like walking on the edge of damnation. But what neither of them understood was that love, in a world built on chains, is a rebellion, and rebellion always demands blood. Soon the servants began to whisper. They saw the way she lingered in the garden when Samuel worked. They saw how he no longer ate with the other slaves, how his clothes were cleaner, how she defended him from rebuke. The walls of the mansion began to tighten around them. Every candle seemed to flicker with judgment, every prayer felt hollow. And yet, the Marquise could not stop. Samuel, bound by duty, could not refuse. Their encounters became sacred and secret, the union of two people who were never meant to touch, finding solace in the only place they could, each other's arms. But paradise built on sin is always temporary. The moment of peace between them was fragile, a breath before the storm, because the world outside that mansion, the world of priests, gossip, and power, would not allow their love to exist. And when it finally came to light, Samuel's beauty, the very thing that made him special, would become his curse. For in Lima, a slave with the grace of a king was more dangerous than an army. In the dim candlelight of her room, the Marquise sat before her mirror, hands trembling, staring at a face she no longer recognized. The reflection staring back at her was not that of a noblewoman, not the image that graced Lima's ballrooms or parish pews. It was the face of a sinner, flushed with longing, heavy with guilt. The gold crucifix around her neck suddenly felt like a weight pressing against her throat, a reminder that she was no longer just a lady of high birth. She was a woman possessed by desire for a man she was forbidden to even see as human. That man was Samuel. Her secret began not in lust, but in loneliness. For years, the Marquise had lived beside her husband, Don Velasco, a man of power but no tenderness. His love was like the church bells, loud, predictable, and hollow. He gave her jewels, estates, and children, but not warmth. Her heart had grown cold within the stone walls of the mansion, surrounded by paintings of saints who offered no comfort and servants who only bowed. Then Samuel arrived. At first, he was nothing more than a shadow at the edge of her days. Another laborer, strong, silent, invisible. But slowly, like a song she could not stop hearing, he began to fill her world. His quiet competence, his strange calm, his voice low and steady as the tide. These things called to her in ways she could not understand. The Marquise tried to resist it. She prayed longer at Mass. She donated more to the church. She spoke kindly to her husband, forcing smiles that made her jaw ache. But none of it could erase the memory of that night in the rain. The night she saw Samuel's eyes lift toward her, not as a servant, but as a man. That look had burned itself into her soul, and try as she might, she could not forget it. Desire, once awakened, is a beast that does not sleep. Her mind became a battlefield between virtue and hunger. Each time she passed him in the corridor, her pulse quickened. Each brush of his hand when he handed her a tray felt like a spark. When she saw him working bare-chested in the fields, his muscles slick with sweat, she would retreat to her chamber, her thoughts trembling between fear and craving. In Lima's upper society, women were not taught to feel. They were taught to obey. Passion belonged to men, women were to endure it. But Samuel awakened in her something deeper than mere lust. With him she felt seen, with him she felt alive. The first time she dared to touch him was by accident, or so she told herself. She had descended to the servants' quarters, pretending to check on the kitchen stores. Samuel stood there, his shirt unbuttoned, repairing a cabinet hinge. She approached under the pretense of inspecting the work, but her gaze lingered too long. Her fingers brushed his arm, just a second, and the contact sent a shiver through both their bodies. He did not move away. He simply looked at her eyes, searching, steady. "Duga Maria," he said softly, voice thick with warning. "Someone might see. Let them," she whispered. But he stepped back, lowering his head. "You have everything," he said quietly. "I have nothing but the right to breathe. Do not take even that from me." His words stung her more than she could admit. That night she wept, not for shame, but for the realization that in a world where she commanded everything, this man was the only thing she could not possess without destroying him. Days turned into weeks. She kept her distance, but the ache remained. And then one evening, while the city celebrated a saint's feast, the mansion fell silent. Most of the servants were gone to attend Mass. Samuel remained behind to guard the house. She found herself wandering the corridors, unable to sleep, drawn by something she could no longer deny. When she saw him standing by the window, moonlight painting his skin silver, she felt the last of her restraint dissolve. "Samuel," she said, her voice trembling, "do you hate me for what I am?" He turned slowly. "I could never hate you, Doga Maria, but I fear what you could do to me. I would never hurt you." He smiled, a sad and knowing smile. "You do not need to lift a hand to hurt me. You need only want me." Her heart broke open then. She crossed the room, her breath shallow, her hand reaching for his face. "Then let me want you just once," she whispered. "Let me remember what it means to be alive." When he didn't pull away, she kissed him. Softly at first, then with all the hunger that had been buried beneath years of silence. In that moment, every wall of rank, race, and rule crumbled. There was no master or slave, no sin or sanctity. Only two souls meeting in defiance of everything they'd been told to be. That night, the Marquise's desire became her damnation. In the weeks that followed, she and Samuel became bound in secrecy. She would summon him under the guise of household duties, polishing her jewelry, fixing her curtains, delivering letters. Each meeting carried the weight of sin and the sweetness of salvation. They spoke in whispers, moved in shadows, and lived between the beats of guilt and passion. But what she called love, the world would call scandal. Her body began to glow again with youth. Her laughter returned. Even her daughters noticed. "Mother," said Lucio once, "you look happier lately. Has father done something kind for you?" The Marquise smiled faintly, but inside she felt the weight of a lie. Desire had become her refuge and her curse. Because secrets in Lima never stayed buried for long, servants whispered. A maid saw Samuel leaving her chambers. A neighbor claimed she heard footsteps in the night, and the church, always watching, began to suspect that the Marquise had fallen under the devil's touch. She prayed harder than ever, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled. But when she closed her eyes, it was Samuel's face she saw, not Christ's. Love had turned to obsession. She no longer cared about salvation or damnation. She wanted him, even if it meant losing everything. And she would. Because forbidden desire, once unleashed, does not fade quietly. It burns until it consumes all, heart, name, and soul alike. The Marquise's secret was no longer hers alone. The whispers were spreading, and in a city built on pride and piety, one woman's longing for a slave would soon bring ruin not only to herself, but to her entire house. The mansion of the Marquise Velasco was built to impress and to intimidate. High stone walls guarded the family's honor, while its wide halls echoed with the kind of silence only wealth could buy. But by the spring of 1803, that silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was tense, charged, heavy with unspoken truths. The walls that once held prayers and laughter now carried whispers. Whispers of a secret too scandalous to remain hidden. It began, as most destructions do, with a single careless sound. One night, when the city slept and the moonlight fell pale upon the tiles, a servant named Inez heard footsteps outside the Marquise's chamber. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably male. She froze in the corridor, pressing herself into the shadows. The door creaked open, just enough for her to see a tall figure. Samuel, stepping out silently, his shirt half-buttoned, his head bowed. The Marquise's voice followed, soft and trembling. "Tomorrow, same time." Inez's heart pounded so loudly she feared they'd hear it. She turned and ran to her quarters, clutching her rosary. She prayed until dawn, but prayer could not silence what she'd seen. In a world where a noblewoman's virtue was the foundation of her family's power, this secret was not merely a sin, it was a weapon. By morning, the whispers had begun. At first, it was nothing but half-spoken sentences and cautious glances. The kitchen servants exchanged knowing looks when Samuel entered the room. The laundress found a silk robe torn at the shoulder and said nothing, only crossed herself. One by one, the mansion's eyes turned toward the Marquise with quiet disbelief. But in Lima, secrets have a way of escaping even the most fortified walls. It was a carriage driver, one of the men who ferried messages between estates, who carried the rumor into the city. They say the Marquise has taken a lover, he told a tavern girl, his voice thick with gossip. And not just any man, a slave. The girl gasped, made the sign of the cross, and before the night was over, the story had traveled from the taverns of the poor to the parlors of the elite. By the time the Marquise hosted her next dinner, the entire city was watching her. The women whispered behind their fans, the men laughed behind their cigars. Her husband, Don Velasco, remained unaware, or perhaps willfully blind. He saw only what pride allowed him to see. He spoke to his guests with the confidence of a man who believed his house untouchable. But beneath the candlelight, his wife's face was pale, her hands trembling as she lifted her wine. Across the table, one of the guests, a visiting priest, fixed his gaze on her and said, "They say the devil tempts even the purest souls, Doa Maria. We must be vigilant, for sin wears many faces." His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered just a moment too long. The Marquise smiled politely, but she could feel her heart clawing against her ribs. That night, she met Samuel again, her fear wrapped tight around her like a cloak. "They know," she whispered, pacing the room. "They're talking. I can feel it." Samuel watched her silently, his face unreadable. "Let them talk," he said at last. "Words are wind." "You don't understand," she hissed. "They could take everything, my children, my name. They could hang you for this!" He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Then send me away." The words pierced her like a blade. "I can't." "Then you must stop this," he said softly, "before it kills us both." Tears filled her eyes. "You think I can stop feeling this? You think I can go back to being what I was?" He reached out and touched her cheek. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "But they will destroy you, and I cannot protect you from them." For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. But love, once infected by fear, becomes something darker. The Marquise began to unravel. She dismissed servants at random, accused them of spying, replaced them with others she trusted less. The house that once thrummed with order descended into quiet chaos. And still, the whispers grew louder. One evening, her eldest daughter, Lucia, approached her. "Mother," she said gently, "the servants say things about you and Samuel. Tell me their lies." The Marquise's blood ran cold. She wanted to deny it, to smile and say it was nonsense. But her lips wouldn't move. She could only stare at her daughter's wide, terrified eyes. "Mother," Lucia whispered again. The Marquise turned away, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Lucia fled the room, sobbing. That was the night Samuel came to her chamber for the last time. "I must leave," he said. "If I stay, they will hang me, and your husband will curse your name to hell. You think I care what they do to me?" she cried. "You are the only truth in my life, Samuel." He shook his head. "You see only love, Doa Maria. But they see a crime." When she tried to hold him, he stepped back, pain etched into every line of his face. "If I stay, you will lose everything. If I go, you may still save yourself." "Save myself?" she whispered. "Without you, there is nothing left to save." He lingered a moment longer, his eyes filled with sorrow, then turned and left. It was the last time she saw him alive. By morning, he was gone, vanished from the estate, his belongings missing, his quarters empty. The slaves whispered that he had run toward the mountains. Others said Don Velasco had discovered the truth and sent men to kill him quietly, to bury the shame before it spread further. But the truth was darker still. 3 days later, a body was found by the river, face unrecognizable, hands bound. The Marquise knew, before anyone said a word, that it was Samuel. She collapsed, screaming his name, while her husband watched in silent fury. That night, he locked her in her chamber and ordered every servant who had spoken her name in gossip to be flogged. The whispers did not stop. They grew into legends, into curses, into the kind of story that outlives its tellers. In Lima, they said the Marquise had been visited by demons. They said the slave she loved had risen from the river to haunt her nights. Some claimed she still roamed the estate, her ghost whispering his name, unable to repent for the sin that cost them both their souls. And though the city moved on, Though her mansion fell to ruin, one truth remained. In a world built on silence and obedience, a whisper of love could still destroy an empire. The storm that had been building for months finally broke on a humid night in June 1803. Lightning cracked over the hills surrounding Lima, the sky trembling as though heaven itself had taken offense at what had transpired inside the Velasco mansion. Don Emilio Velasco, a man of strict honor and violent temper, stood in the grand hall, his wife's shawl clenched in his hand, while the last candle on the mantel flickered and died. For days, rumors had plagued him. At first, he ignored them, dismissed them as jealous talk from rival nobles. But then came the letter. It arrived in the morning, sealed in red wax, unsigned. The words were short, written in a neat, feminine hand. Your wife's virtue lies in the arms of a slave. The child she carries is not your own. He read it 3 times before the meaning settled like poison in his chest. His hands shook. He tore the paper apart. But the words remained carved in his mind. That night, without a word to anyone, he began to watch. He saw the way Maria flinched when Samuel's name was mentioned. He saw how the slave's eyes lowered too quickly in her presence. He noticed how her door, once locked at night, now stood slightly ajar, and then came the sound, a muffled laugh, a whisper, a rustle in the dark. Don Emilio froze outside his wife's chamber, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, with one motion, he pushed the door open, and the world he thought he ruled shattered in an instant. There, by the faint glow of the fire, lay the truth. His wife, bare and trembling. The slave half-dressed, his body still gleaming with sweat. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Don Emilio's voice broke the silence. It wasn't a shout. It was worse, a whisper laced with venom. Samuel turned, his eyes calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Maria gasped, rising to her knees. "Emilio, please! Silence!" he snapped. His pistol was already in his hand. The slave did not plead. He stood straight, his expression unreadable, as lightning flashed behind the window. "You have defiled my house," Don Emilio hissed. "You've turned my wife into filth." Samuel's voice was quiet. "It was she who came to me." The words hit like a blade. Maria sobbed, clutching her chest. "Do you mock me?" Emilio roared. "In my own home, you dare speak her name? She is human," Samuel said simply. "She loved, as you never could." Before the echo faded, the shot rang out. The bullet tore through Samuel's shoulder, throwing him back. Maria screamed, rushing to him. But Emilio grabbed her by the hair and flung her aside. "You will watch," he said. "You will watch him die for what he's done." Samuel staggered to his feet, blood pouring down his arm, his breath heavy but defiant. "You can kill me," he said, "but the truth will never die with me. Truth!" Emilio spat. "The truth is this." He struck Samuel across the face with the pistol again and again, until the man fell to his knees. Maria's cries echoed through the house. Servants crowded in the hall but dared not enter. They knew better than to interrupt a master's fury. Emilio raised the pistol again, but something in Samuel's eyes stopped him. There was no fear there, only pity. "You think yourself a man," Samuel said, his voice weak but steady. "But you are a coward who hides behind power." The words ignited something primal. Emilio screamed, swinging the gun down. But before he could fire again, Maria threw herself over Samuel's body. "Enough!" she cried. "You've taken everything from me. Do you want my soul, too?" Emilio froze, his finger trembling on the trigger. Then he lowered the gun, his face hardening into something cold and final. "No," he said. "I want him gone." He motioned to the guards. "Take him. Chain him. Make sure the city sees what happens to a slave who forgets his place." Maria screamed as they dragged Samuel away, his blood leaving a dark trail on the marble floor. She tried to follow, but Emilio caught her by the wrist. "You will not move," he said. "You will live with this shame. You will carry it in your womb, in your name, until the end of your days." And then, with a cruel smirk, he whispered, "If that child you carry is his, I will see it buried before it draws its first breath." Her knees buckled. He left her there, broken, bleeding, alone, as thunder rolled above the mansion like the voice of an angry god. Samuel's punishment was swift. At dawn, they chained him to a post in the courtyard, a spectacle for all the slaves to witness. Emilio stood before them, his face expressionless. "This man betrayed his master," he declared. "He touched what was forbidden. Let him be an example." The overseer raised his whip, But before the lash struck, Samuel spoke. His voice carried through the morning air, deep and unshaken. "You can kill me," he said, "but you cannot unlove what was loved, nor cleanse your name of the blood you spill today." Then the whip cracked. The sound echoed through the plantation like thunder. Again and again, until his body slumped forward, unmoving. When it was over, the slaves lowered their eyes in silence. The overseer stepped back, sweat and guilt on his brow. Emilio turned away, but not before noticing the strange calm on Samuel's lifeless face. A peace his violence could not erase. That night, the Marquise went mad. She screamed his name until her voice failed. She tore her gown, clawed at the walls, and cursed her husband to the depths of hell. The servants whispered that she could see Samuel's ghost standing at her window, smiling sadly in the moonlight. Weeks later, she vanished. Some said she drowned herself in the river where Samuel's body had been found. Others claimed she fled into the mountains, carrying his unborn child. As for Don Emilio, his house never knew peace again. His crops failed, his servants fled, and by the next year, the Velasco name had become a curse in Lima. People said the winds that passed through the old estate carried a single word, a whisper that chilled even the bravest hearts: loved. And every storm that passed after that was said to bear the echo of that night, when a husband's pride met a slave's defiance, and the blood of both stained the soil of Peru forever. After the night of blood and betrayal, the Velasco mansion fell silent, not the kind of silence born of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a scream too loud to forget. The walls seemed to remember what had happened. Servants spoke in whispers. Candles refused to stay lit for long, as though the air itself no longer wished to bear witness. The Marquise, once a woman of grace and command, had become a ghost in her own home. Her husband, Don Emilio Velasco, was dead. They said he shot himself one night in the study, though no one heard the gunshot. Others claimed the mirror shattered first, as if his reflection had turned on him. The truth, like everything about that cursed family, was swallowed by the mansion's dark heart. But the Marquise lived on. Some said she had lost her mind. Others said her mind had become too clear, that she had begun to see things others could not. Servants told tales of her wandering the halls barefoot, whispering in the dark, her once luxurious hair unkempt, her eyes hollow. She spoke to no one, except to Samuel. Every night, she would light a single candle, place it by the window, and murmur his name into the wind. Some claimed they saw a shadow outside, tall and still, as if something, or someone, was listening. Weeks passed, then months. Her body began to change. Her hands trembled when she touched her stomach. She had no physician, she wanted none. When a maid dared ask if she was ill, the Marquise smiled faintly and said, "I carry the truth." Lima's society recoiled in horror when rumors spread the widow of Don Emilio Velasco was with child. And though no one dared speak it aloud, every whispered prayer, every cruel smirk, carried the same word: Samuel. The church condemned her. The governor demanded her confinement, but no law could touch her. The Velasco name, tarnished though it was, still held enough power to keep the city at bay. In the mansion's decaying nursery, she prepared the cradle herself. The same cradle that had once held her daughters, now long gone, hidden away by relatives who wanted no part in her scandal. Each night she sang lullabies, old songs from the coast, songs Samuel had once hummed while working the fields. As her belly grew, so did the strange happenings. Windows opened on their own. The scent of tobacco, Samuel's scent, lingered in rooms long after she'd closed them. On stormy nights, the candle she left by the window would burn blue instead of gold. Servants began to quit. Those who stayed refused to enter the west wing, claiming they heard footsteps pacing when the Marquise slept. Then, one night, the pains began. The rain hammered the roof, the thunder rolling like war drums. The midwife, an old woman named Rosa, came trembling to the mansion. She had delivered noble children before, but never one spoken of in curses. The labor lasted through the night. The Marquise screamed until her voice broke, her cries echoing through the hallways, shaking the portraits from the walls. Between contractions, she called Samuel's name as if he stood beside her, holding her hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "You said love never dies." When the child came, the midwife gasped, not from horror, but from awe. The baby's skin was not pale like the mother's, nor dark like the father's. It was bronze, a perfect blending of both. His eyes opened immediately, wide and calm, the color of storm clouds. The Marquise smiled weakly. He has his father's eyes. But before she could hold him, Rosa hesitated. She glanced at the newborn's chest. A small, strange birthmark rested just above his heart. It looked like a shape burned into the flesh, a crescent, almost like a brand. "What is it?" the Marquise asked, fear flickering in her tone. The midwife crossed herself. "I've seen such marks before, Siora. Once, long ago, on a man taken from the coast of Africa. They said it was the mark of his tribe, a sign of power." The Marquise clutched the child to her chest. "Then he carries his father's strength." But Rosa's voice trembled. "Or his curse." Within days, the midwife was gone. She fled the city, whispering that the child had been born under unnatural stars. Still, the Marquise loved the boy fiercely. She named him Matthias, a name meaning gift of God. Yet she knew he would never be accepted. The world had already decided what he was, a sin made flesh. The church refused baptism. Neighbors crossed themselves when she walked past. And at night, she began to hear the whispers again, this time not from her own mind. "Ma'am." The voice came from the cradle, soft, impossible. She froze, the candlelight flickering across her trembling hands. "Samuel," she whispered. "Mom," the voice said again, clearer this time. She approached the cradle, her breath caught in her throat. The child lay sleeping, peaceful, still. But when she touched his cheek, the candle went out. And in the darkness, she felt another hand, rough, calloused, brush against hers. "Don't be afraid," the voice murmured. "He will never be alone." The Marquise collapsed beside the cradle, tears streaming down her face. She sobbed. "Is it truly you?" Silence. Only the wind answered. But when morning came, she found something on the floor beside her. A single red rose, fresh and dewy, lying where no one had walked. From that day forward, she believed Samuel's spirit lived within their son. She spoke to the boy as though he understood, telling him of the father he would never meet. When he laughed, she swore she could hear Samuel's voice in his tone. When he slept, she saw the shadow of a tall man standing at the window, watching over them both. As Matthias grew, strange things happened. Objects moved when he cried. Lamps flickered when he laughed. And sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, the servants swore they heard two voices humming the same lullaby. The Marquise was no longer mad, or perhaps she had found peace within her madness. Her love had defied death, class, and God himself. The mansion that once reeked of scandal now hummed with a strange, sacred power. But the world beyond its walls had not forgotten. Lima's priests called the child an abomination. The governor's men wanted him seized. Rumors claimed the Marquise was raising the devil's son, that his eyes could summon storms. And one night, when soldiers came to the mansion to take the boy, the house erupted in thunder. They found the cradle empty. The Marquise was gone too. Her footprints led to the cliffs beyond the city. At the edge, they found nothing but that same single red rose still fresh, untouched by the rain. Some said she leapt. Others swore she flew. But in the years that followed, travelers claimed that in the northern highlands, a woman and a boy lived among the villagers. She pale as moonlight, he bronze as dawn. And that when storms came, they smiled. For love like theirs, they said even death had no dominion. Lima 1803. A city gilded by faith and chained by fear. Beneath the echo of cathedral bells, sin was measured not in acts of cruelty but in defiance of bloodlines. The Marquise Velasco's scandal had cracked the very foundation of that world. A noblewoman bearing the child of a slave. For the church and the crown, it was more than a disgrace. It was heresy. By the time whispers of her child's birth reached the archbishop, they had grown into monstrous tales. Some said the infant spoke the moment he emerged. Others swore that when he cried, thunder rolled over Lima, shaking the marble saints that guarded its churches. The people, superstitious and terrified, began calling him El Niño del Pecado, the child of sin. For weeks, the city buzzed with rumors. Women crossed themselves when the Marquise's name was mentioned. Men lowered their voices when passing her abandoned mansion, where candlelight still flickered at odd hours. The Inquisition had not been fully dissolved in Peru, and what was once a spiritual court now acted as the moral fist of the city. It was only a matter of time before that fist came knocking. The archbishop, a man named Esteban Lacerna, was known for his iron heart and his obsession with purity. He had watched Lima's nobility decay under whispers of corruption, foreign influence, and lust. The scandal of the Marquise was, to him, proof that the devil had sunk his claws into the city's soul. And so he ordered an inquiry. 3 inquisitors were sent to the Velasco estate, Father Ruiz, the confessor of the dead Don Emilio, Brother Hernan, a man whose sermons spoke more of fire than forgiveness, and Sister Magdalena, a silent observer whose devotion was so absolute it bordered on cruelty. They arrived on horseback one gray morning, their robes heavy, their expressions colder than the fog that clung to the city. But when they reached the mansion, they found it empty. The servants were gone. The doors were bolted. Dust lay thick on the marble floor, and yet a single candle burned in the window of the nursery, untouched by wind. Inside the cradle lay not a child, but a letter. The Marquise's handwriting was elegant, unwavering. You hunt a sin that God himself permitted. You curse what love created. If your God despises the union of body and soul, then he is not mine. My son carries both worlds in his blood. He will not kneel before either. The letter ended without signature, only a pressed rose petal red, dried, and unbroken. The inquisitors burned the cradle and left with fury in their hearts. But Sister Magdalena lingered. She claimed she felt something watching her from the shadows, something vast, sorrowful, and defiant. Days later, word spread that the Marquise and her child had been sighted in the highlands, living among freed slaves and runaways. She was said to heal the sick, speak to the wind, and command storms with her prayers. To the peasants, she was a saint. To the church, she was a witch. The archbishop, humiliated and enraged, declared her an enemy of the cross. A decree was written. Any who aided her would be branded a heretic. But vengeance in Lima did not come only from the church. The noble families whose names the Marquise had once shared tables with now sought to erase her memory entirely. They funded bounty hunters and mercenaries, whispering promises of gold for proof of her death. Her family's lands were seized. Her portrait in the cathedral's gallery was painted over, her face replaced by an empty golden frame. And yet, the city could not wash her away. Storms began to strike Lima without warning. Statues cracked, lightning struck the towers of San Francisco Church, and each flash illuminated the silhouette of a woman in the sky, arms outstretched, a child at her side. The people began to murmur again, not in condemnation, but in awe. La Mariscala del Trueno, they called her, the Lady of Thunder. The archbishop ordered public prayers to dispel her spirit. Churches rang their bells through the night. Priests sprinkled holy water on every doorstep, and sermons thundered against her name. But fear had changed its shape. The people no longer feared her. They feared the church's blindness. One night, as the archbishop knelt before the altar, a wind tore through the cathedral. The candles extinguished, and the great iron cross above the pulpit fell, splitting the marble floor. Witnesses swore they saw the figure of a woman at the doorway, her hair black as ash, her eyes like lightning. When light returned, the archbishop was gone. His vestments were found days later near the river, soaked and tangled in reeds. No body was ever recovered. After that, the Inquisition's hunt ended abruptly. The surviving inquisitors vanished into exile or silence, and the name Velasco became legend, whispered only in the dark. But in the outskirts, travelers told stories of a woman who walked among slaves and peasants, her child at her side. She taught them to read the stars, to farm the barren earth, to fight the lash with unity. When storms came, she lifted her hands to the sky, and rain would fall only where her people needed it most. In time, her followers grew into hundreds. They said her child, Matias, possessed his father's strength and his mother's voice, that when he spoke, men put down their weapons. And so, the church called them heretics, the people called them free. The vengeance of Lima, the wrath of religion, of power, of patriarchy, had birthed something it could not destroy, a faith that belonged to no altar. A faith born from love and defiance, from the union of the enslaved and the enslaver. In the years that followed, old women in the markets told their grandchildren the story. When the lightning strikes, it is not God's anger. It is the Marquise reminding Lima that love will not bow. And when the rain fell gently after, mothers would lift their children to the window and whisper, "Look, that is her blessing." The Inquisition's wrath may have burned her name from the records, but it could not erase her echo from the air, because some storms, once born, never die. They simply change the sky they live in. When the storm finally passed over Lima, the city woke to silence. The kind that comes after something divine has walked through and left its mark. The Marquise Velasco had vanished into the highlands, but she had not gone alone. Clutched to her chest was the child that the church called a curse, and that she called a miracle. His name was Matthias. No one in the capital saw him grow, but his legend reached back like thunder. The child who was said to have cried lightning into the sky. The boy whose laughter made the wind shift. They said he bore his father's dark skin and his mother's pale eyes, an impossible blend that made even the devout tremble. Years passed, and Matthias grew in the shadow of mountains and rebellion. His mother, once a noblewoman, had become a shepherd of souls, gathering the outcasts, the escaped, the broken. Her followers called her La Santa Mestiza, the Holy Mixed One. She spoke of a world beyond masters and bloodlines, and Matthias listened. Every night, she taught him words that the church had forbidden: freedom, dignity, choice. He was 12 when the first miracle happened. A drought had struck the valley where they lived. Crops failed, rivers turned to dust, and children cried from hunger. The elders begged the heavens for rain, but none came. Finally, the Marquise led her people to the highest ridge, where she had once prayed as a child in the city's chapel. Matthias followed barefoot, his hair tangled and his eyes bright like dawn breaking through fog. When she knelt to pray, he did not. Instead, he stood still, staring at the sky. The clouds above him began to twist, slow at first, then faster, spiraling around a single point. The wind whipped through the camp, snapping banners and cloaks. People fell to their knees, not in fear but awe. A drop of rain fell on his forehead, then another, then thousands. Within minutes, the dry earth turned to mud. Rivers swelled, and the valley bloomed again. From that day, the people called him El Hijo del Trueno, the son of thunder. But miracles, no matter how beautiful, always draw eyes and enemies. News of the boy reached Lima again. To the church, Matthias was not a child but a weapon of blasphemy, a living reminder that their laws could not tame nature or blood. They called him El Demonio Mestizo, the mixed blood demon. The archbishop's successor declared a holy mandate: capture the boy and bring him to the city to be purified by the flame. And so, soldiers were sent, men who believed they were hunting the devil. They rode into the mountains with crosses and rifles, shouting hymns into the wind. They found the camp at dawn. The Marquise stood before her followers, her body frail but her gaze unbroken. Matthias was beside her, his hand gripping hers. "Do not run," she whispered. "They can burn our names, but not our truth." It was when the soldiers approached, Matthias stepped forward. He was 16 then, tall, silent, calm. One of the men, the captain, spat at his feet. "Kneel, boy," he hissed. "The church will save your soul before it burns your body." The Matthias didn't answer. He only looked toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered as if waiting for his command. The captain raised his rifle. The shot never came. Lightning split the sky, a white spear that struck the earth between them. The ground shook, horses screamed, and men fell to their knees. The captain's cross melted in his hand. The storm roared to life, tearing banners and scattering the soldiers into chaos. When it was over, the valley was empty. The Marquise and her son were gone. For years after, the story of Matthias spread like wildfire through the colonies. Runaway slaves spoke of a boy who moved with the storms, who appeared in the night to free chained men and vanish before dawn. They said he never spoke above a whisper, but when he did, the wind carried his words for miles. "No one owns the rain," he would say. "No one owns you." The church branded him a false prophet. Pamphlets were printed declaring him a heretic, a sorcerer, the bastard child of the devil himself. But among the poor, his name became a prayer. As mothers whispered over their children when thunder rolled, "Let the storm pass gently." It is said that one day, when he was a grown man, he returned to Lima, not as a fugitive, but as a shadow. He walked through the city cloaked and unseen, passing the cathedral where his mother's name had been erased. He stopped before the altar, placed a single white rose upon it, and whispered something only the marble saints could hear. When the dawn came, every painting in the cathedral, saints, angels, and holy men, bore streaks of dark pigment across their faces. For the first time in that city built on hierarchy and sin, every image of heaven looked a little more human. After that, no one ever saw him again. But in the villages, when the clouds gathered and the air grew heavy, people still turned their faces to the wind and smiled, because they knew Matthias was still out there. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in thunder, in the roar of defiance that could never again be silenced. and the storm, his eternal companion, would carry his voice through time. "We were born of sin," they said, "but we were only born of love, and love is the loudest storm." By 1820, the city of Lima had nearly forgotten her name, or so they pretended. The Marquise Velasco, once the pinnacle of noble grace, had become a whispered curse in parlors and pulpits alike. Mothers used her as a warning for their daughters. Priests used her as proof of sin's power. But while the elite of Lima told themselves her scandal was buried beneath decades of dust, the mountains remembered her differently. The villagers said she had become a prophet, not one born of scripture, but of suffering. Her words, they claimed, carried the sting of truth that even heaven could not silence. And though no one had seen her in years, her followers swore that the winds still carried her voice across the valleys. It began with a rumor, as all revolutions do. In 1820, an earthquake shook the heart of Lima, splitting the cathedral steps in two. Inside, a fresco depicting the Holy Mother began to flake, revealing beneath it an older, hidden image, a dark-skinned woman holding a child of light. The priests called it an abomination. The people called it la Señora Mestiza, the mixed lady. Days later, a letter appeared at the cathedral doors. No one saw who left it, but the handwriting was unmistakable, elegant looping, unmistakably that of the Marquise. It read, "You can bury the flesh, but not the blood. The child you condemned is the storm you now fear. Heaven does not need your permission to love what you despise." The archbishop, trembling with fury, declared the letter a hoax. Yet within days, a second letter appeared, then a third, then a dozen, each one more haunting than the last. They appeared in confessionals, in priestly quarters, even upon the marble altar itself. Each letter was written in the same hand. Each bore the same seal, a sun split in half, one side dark, one side light. The city was paralyzed. Some said the Marquise had returned. Others whispered that her ghost walked the streets at night, carrying her prophecy like a flame. The archbishop ordered an investigation, but every attempt to trace the source ended in ruin. The scribe who handled the first letter went mad, carving symbols into the church floor until he collapsed. A young acolyte who found a second letter vanished before dawn. A messenger sent to burn one of the parchments dropped dead in the street, his face twisted in terror. The church, terrified yet defiant, called for a week of prayer and penance. But even prayers turned to panic when the bells of Lima's cathedral began to ring by themselves at midnight. The archbishop, desperate to restore order, gathered his council and declared a final act. They would read aloud the letters, one by one, and refute them before the people, proving once and for all that heaven had not turned against them. The day of the reading came. The cathedral was filled to bursting, nobles, peasants, freed slaves, and soldiers, all watching as the archbishop stood at the altar, trembling with both fear and pride. He opened the first letter. It spoke of mercy, of forgiveness, of the blood of slaves mixing with that of kings, and of God's hand in both. The archbishop sneered, calling it heresy. The crowd murmured. He opened the second. It spoke of balance, that no skin, no gender, no soul was born unworthy. That love, not lineage, defined the divine. The archbishop tore it in half and shouted that the devil had written it. By the time he reached the final letter, the air inside the cathedral had grown heavy, almost electric. The last letter was sealed not with wax, but with ash. The archbishop hesitated, his hands trembling. But pride drove him forward. He broke the seal and began to read. "When heaven's tears fall black, and fire kisses the steeple, you will know. It was never I who turned from God. It was God who turned from you." A wind cut through the cathedral. Candles went out one by one. The stained glass rattled like bones. Then, in a silence that made even the proudest noble tremble, the roof split open. Lightning struck the steeple, shattering it into 1,000 burning shards. Flames climbed the walls, devouring centuries of piety and gold. The archbishop screamed, clutching the holy book to his chest as the people fled in chaos. Outside, the sky turned the color of blood. Rain began to fall, but not water, ash. The prophecy had come true. When the fire finally died, the cathedral stood hollow, blackened, its grand cross melted into a twisted shape. And upon the altar, untouched by flame, lay the final letter, now scorched at the edges, but still legible. At its bottom was a signature no one had seen before. Not the Marquise's, but her son's, Metias Velasco, the storm you feared. After that day, no more letters appeared. The church rebuilt its walls, replaced its frescoes, and rewrote its records. But something had changed in Lima. The peasants began to pray not to saints or angels, but to La Señora Mestiza, a symbol of forbidden love, divine justice, and rebellion against the chains of blood and faith. The church called it blasphemy. The people called it truth. And in every storm that rolled through the city, the lightning seemed to strike the cathedral first, as if heaven itself was still remembering. Historians later dismissed the story as myth, a convenient legend to explain a natural disaster. But in the villages outside Lima, where the mountains touch the clouds, they still leave 2 candles at their doorsteps during storms, one white, one black. For the Marquise, for her son, for the prophecy that proved heaven could love the damned. By the mid-19th century, Lima had changed beyond recognition. The Spanish crown had loosened its grip. The Inquisition had faded into history, and the old aristocratic houses that once ruled the city had either fallen to ruin or turned into museums of faded pride. Yet, among the remnants of that gilded decay, there persisted a quiet whisper. The blood of Velasco still walks the earth. They called them the children of heaven and earth. Born from the scandal that once set Lima aflame, these descendants carried not just mixed blood, but mixed destiny, half of noble lineage, half of enslaved resilience. To some they were cursed, to others divine. It began with a woman named Catalina, the granddaughter of the Marquis Velasco and Samuel, the slave whose love defied empires. She was said to have the Marquis's pale green eyes, but Samuel's strength and grace. Raised in secrecy by a convent that owed its silence to the Velasco fortune, Catalina learned to read the scriptures by candlelight and to hide her name like a wound. But the world has a way of finding what it fears most. At 16, Catalina ran away from the convent and joined a traveling troupe of mestizo performers who carried stories from village to village. There, among the drums, the masks, and the flickering torches, she found freedom and her voice. Every night she would tell the tale of the Marquise and her slave, of forbidden love that defied church and crown. But she never spoke it as tragedy. She told it as prophecy. They called her a sinner, she would say, her voice echoing under the stars. But what she birthed was not shame. It was the future. People began to listen. Peasants, freed slaves, and even Creole merchants gathered to hear her speak. To some, she was just a storyteller. To others, she was something holy, the living proof that the old blood still ran through the veins of the new world. But with power comes danger. By 1851, the church began to take notice. Rumors spread that a woman claiming descent from the devil's house of Velasco was preaching rebellion disguised as faith. A priest in Trujillo declared her words heresy. The Bishop of Lima demanded her arrest, but Catalina kept moving, through jungles, across mountains, always ahead of those who sought to silence her. Her followers called her La Hija del Sol, the daughter of the sun. They believed she could heal the sick, command the storms, and summon the spirits of her ancestors. She denied being divine, yet strange things always seemed to follow her. In one village, a child born blind regained his sight after she prayed over him. In another, rain fell for the first time in 3 years after she spoke Samuel's name aloud. And when she passed through the ruins of the old Velasco estate, lightning struck the earth 3 times. Just as her grandmother's letters had once foretold. Catalina's legend grew, but so did the fear. The government accused her of inciting rebellion. The church accused her of witchcraft. Both were right in their own ways. Catalina's words were fire, and fire always spreads. Your heaven is built on our chains, she told the people. But even angels fall when they forget who they were made from. By the time they captured her in 1853, she had gathered hundreds who believed in her cause, not of war, but of awakening. They took her to the same cathedral that once burned with her grandmother's letters and demanded she confess her heresy. She refused. When the bishop accused her of being a child of sin, she smiled and answered, "No, I am a child of both." They sentenced her to hang. But as the rope was tied around her neck, the sky turned dark. Witnesses said thunder rolled across Lima, though no storm had been forecast. The executioner hesitated. Catalina looked to the heavens and whispered the words her grandmother had once written. Heaven does not need your permission to love what you despise. A single bolt of lightning struck the gallows. When the smoke cleared, the crowd screamed. Catalina was gone. Some claimed she burned to ash. Others swore they saw her walking barefoot through the smoke, her eyes glowing like 2 suns. Either way, she was never found. In the decades that followed, stories of the Daughter of the Sun spread across Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. Her followers became known as the Children of Heaven and Earth, a secret lineage that blended faith, rebellion, and memory. They carried no banners, no armies, only words. Yet those words would inspire future revolutions, songs, and prayers for generations. By 1903, on the centennial of the original scandal, a journalist discovered a sealed letter hidden in the archives of the burned Velasco mansion. It was addressed simply, "To whoever carries my name in secret." It read, "Our blood is both sin and salvation. Let no man or crown tell you which half to hide. We are the proof that love can outlive its punishment. Tell our story, until the world forgets why it was forbidden." No one knows who wrote it, the Marquise, Samuel, or Catalina, but it became the creed of those who refused to be erased. Today, in the highlands of Peru, descendants still light 2 candles, one white, one black, whenever thunder rolls, one for heaven, one for earth, one for love that refused to die. Because the legend of the Marquise and her slave was never about sin. It was about defiance, about the human heart daring to cross every boundary that power tried to draw. And so, long after the mansions crumbled and the cathedrals turned to dust, the bloodline of rebellion still beats quietly in the hearts of those who remember. They are the forgotten children of Lima, the ones who were never supposed to exist, the ones born of both heaven and earth. And their story, whispered through centuries, is not yet over.